Okay, ready when you are.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. So, thanks everyone for coming to this lightning round talk on accessible, making your publisher provided PowerPoints even more accessible than they already are. I'm Matt McLeskey. Just finished my fourth year on the tenure track in the Department of Criminal Justice. And for this calendar year, I'm one of the accessibility fellows. And so one thing that stood out to me throughout the fellowship, since we started in January, was the role of publisher provided PowerPoints in teaching and learning. So if you give me a sec to get situated here, because the Zoom bar is not always your friend. There we go. That's better. Because I need to toggle through up here. So given what's happening with accessibility nationwide, publishers like Sage, one of the most prominent publishers in the social sciences, which are my fields. I'm a sociologist by training, but I'm in the Department of Criminal Justice at SUNY Oswego. So Sage does a lot with sociology and criminology. You can see here on their website, they, like many other publishers, are already trying to be at the forefront of accessibility and access. So you can see here on their website, they have an accessibility page discussing ADA Title II issues, how this relates to their content that they provide people. Their ebooks are accessible, et cetera, et cetera. So, what I want to talk about is just because you are using materials that a textbook publisher says are accessible, it doesn't mean they're not accessible because they're not 0% accessible, but they're not as accessible as they probably could be. So, if anyone was here at the Accessibility Summit early in the semester, we learned that accessibility is something we can probably never be 100% fully at. It's this ever evolving process that we want to continually try to be better and better at. And so today I'm going to focus on three things that the textbook publisher provided materials for one of my classes, criminal law, does well. And then three things that it could do better, or at the very least, are things that the instructor should look out for to make their materials even more accessible. So, just to give you an example here, I taught criminal law for the first time this past spring. This is one of the most popular textbooks for criminal law in criminal justice and legal studies. One of the colleagues in my department who also teaches criminal law uses it. And so, as is common, if you click here under resources, two common things you get with a publisher provided textbook: a test bank and PowerPoints. So, where we're going to start is I'm going to show you the textbook PowerPoint for chapter one. I'm going to point out three things it does well in terms of accessibility. And I'm going to go over three things that anyone would want to change or improve to make it even more accessible. And so before I start, one thing I'm drawing on is this PowerPoint checklist from the Accessibility Summit from early in the semester. And so it gives the best, particularly in terms of what we have access to easily at Oswego, overview of things to look out for. You'll see here things like text size, color contrast as well, which I'll be talking about today. I also came across another website, University of Oxford's Center for Teaching and Learning, has a wonderful accessible teaching and learning resource page, which I would consider bookmarking as a resource. From this page, I found their Creating Accessible PowerPoint Presentations page, and I learned a couple things that I'll focus on today that were not in the uh, Accessibility Summit document. So let's get started. First thing. So I put the publisher provided PowerPoint into Google Docs. That way it's easier to share with you. I'm just bouncing around between web browser slides. First thing, one of the most important things for anyone with visual impairment, if someone is neurodivergent, even, is the importance of color contrast. So, one thing my Sage PowerPoint does well, it gives essentially black and white, black text on a white background with this dark turquoise kind of coral border at the top. So, one of the key things is color contrast for readability, particularly in a large lecture hall. Um, this prevents eye strain, prevents eye fatigue. Although, as I'll mention when we go over the not so great things about this PowerPoint, is that white is not the color you want to use. So I'll get to that in a second. So if we scroll down, you'll see that it's consistent throughout. This might be obvious, but it's easy. Maybe if you're cobbling together PowerPoints from different materials, you're inserting some of your own material into a textbook publisher provided PowerPoint, which is common. I do that for them to start looking inconsistent. And while you may not always need, say, a border, like the turquoise border up top, you of course always want headers, just like a table of contents for a book or having the proper sections of a journal article. You want to have your headers. So, of course, we start with the intro. You can see there, criminal law terms and concepts has 5 slides, numbered 1 through 5. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, all of the slides themselves are numbered. So even though this is the 5th of 5 slides for criminal law terms and concepts, it's the 7th slide in the deck. So this is, of course, very important for students for following along while in class. Just like you would number pages in a Word document, if they're numbered, they're more easy to find. And so, of course, this is something that Sage, the textbook publisher, provides for us as instructors, which is really helpful. The next important thing is when we're dealing with images. So I'll use these two on slides 5 and slide 6. Figure 1.1, morals, wrongs, and criminal actions, which I used this extensively when I was teaching. The overlap section in Part B shows how we have things that are morally wrong or ethically wrong, socially wrong, criminal wrong, which is solely legal, but an act can, of course, be both, which is the overlap section of B. The color contrast here, I think, is good. Could possibly be a little better, but is stark enough it gets the point across. It might be better with maybe black, a lighter color, and gray. The 2 shades of blue do maybe bleed into each other a little bit, but you should be able to see some contrast. Note how it's labeled, figure 1.1. With the table, which is really important when we start thinking about STEM fields, 1.2, mala inse and mala prohibita offenses. Those are Latin terms. Having the columns labeled is important for machine readability. So you want to consider constructing your PowerPoint in the same way as you might construct a Word document with headers, subheaders, everything being labeled, because this is what allows a screen reader to read this PowerPoint as though it was a text document. So that, of course, is super important for individuals who are visually impaired. And then note there the link at the bottom, access the long description for image. And so you can click on that. That is important for machine readability as well, particularly just with images. If you use images of any kind from a Google image search, from a news article, I use a lot of those to visually illustrate certain points I'm trying to make. So, of course, if someone is visually impaired, they need that image textually transcribed so they know what students are looking at. So, what's great is any image in this PowerPoint has what's called the alt text, which is the text that a machine reader reads to the listener so they can visualize on their own what they are perhaps unable to see. So this is what's going well with this Sage PowerPoint. Now we're going to focus on three things that could be easily improved upon. So I'm going to go to first back to University of Oxford. And so one thing that I found interesting when I was reading this this morning is, so note here in this bullet point, ensure that there's a strong contrast between text and background. For example, dark text on a pastel or cream background, not white. Try to avoid contrasting red and green, as these colors can be difficult for those with color blindness to differentiate. I had never thought about, before I read this, white being a problem. Oxford here does not tell us why white is a problem. So I went over to the Google machine and I asked, why do we not want to use a white background on an accessible PowerPoint? And our friend Gemini said that pure white slides cause high glare, which can trigger visual fatigue, migraines, and severe reading difficulties for neurodivergent individuals. It would even contribute to screen fatigue and mental overload, even for those who are not diagnosed or self-identify as neurodivergent. So rather than white, we would probably want to switch this then to a soft cream or beige. So basically think of Crate and Barrel. That's what you ideally would change it to. So that's the first thing. So on the one hand, we want contrast, but we don't want such stark contrast that it overloads us in a different way. So the next thing, if we go back to Oxford, gives us some information about different text sizes between the content, like your bullet points, and the header. Your text, your slide text should be 20 to 28 points. Header text 30, 44. So you can see here, if we scroll back up to just a general slide, the header slide, criminal law terms and concepts, I would argue does not stand out in contrast to what comes under it, which is defining crime and the three bullet points under it. So one way around this, so where did my taskbar go? Normally just use PowerPoint. So I would advise making these a little larger. In this case, actually, I don't seem able to do this in Google Doc, but what I will do is open the PowerPoint real quick. So you see here, the heading's 40, the text is 32. I would argue these should be farther apart in terms of their font size. But if we bold criminal law terms and concepts, even though we have to stretch that box, that gets us a little closer to differentiating the header from the text itself. I would argue having a line underneath the header in your text box um, to further differentiate the parts of each individual slide. So we, of course, want this to be as machine readable as possible, but also as visually skimmable and comprehensible to anyone. And so that's making sure our header is as differentiated as possible from our text. So I think underlining helps a little bit with that. And lastly, as is often the case with textbook publisher slides, even before we were really thinking about accessibility as concretely as we are now, if you look at slide 7 here, criminal law terms and concepts, this slide is a little busy. We've got 4 bullet points: adultery, felony, victimless crime, and sanctions as part of victimless crimes. It's the 5th of this particular section, criminal law terms and concepts. We go back to Oxford real quick. Note that second bullet point under making text and structure accessible, minimize the amount of text on each slide and keep the layout simple using bullet points. If you find yourself putting a lot of text on a slide, then provide this as a separate file instead. So this particular slide, as an example, you can't really add much to it. You could add an image in that white space, but you're not really able to add any additional text without making it busier, maybe a little less comprehensible. So I would argue each bullet point should be its own slide, which allows you maybe to add a couple examples just in a few words. If you're using a PowerPoint as an outline, then this would work okay, but that would probably mean one is just reciting lecture notes, or perhaps writing on the chalkboard or dry erase board in their classroom. So on the one hand, PowerPoints can be outlines, but you want to stay away from making a slide be too busy. So I would argue making each bullet point its own slide, but that then means renumbering these numbers in your header here. So then 5 of 5, criminal law terms and concepts will probably become a 10 slide section. And so while it's great, a textbook publisher gives us things numbered, if we change them, we obviously have to change that sequence so our students don't get confused. So 3 things to think about in terms of accessibility that will probably save you time if you're using textbook publisher materials. And then 3 things to think about changing or revising to make your materials even more accessible. Just because a textbook publisher says they're giving you accessible materials doesn't mean you don't have to do anything to make it more accessible or hit kind of general standard of what we consider to be accessible for students. So I think my 20 minutes are up. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. As the accessibility fellow, I think that's supposed to be my job. If there are no questions, then I will say I'm done. But if anyone wants to follow up or needs the links of anything I used today, feel free to shoot me an email and I'm happy to provide them to you.